So good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are, and welcome to this online conference. This is the first lecture of a series on religion and water, organized by NICHE, the New Institute Center for Environmental Humanities, and by the Department of Asian and North African Studies, both at Foscari University of Venice, in collaboration with our student association, Gesshin. So our presenter today is Francesca Monteith, who is research lecturer at the School of Cultural Heritage, Northwest University of Xi'an. And she will give a lecture, as you can see, titled Water Words of Southern Sichuan in the Tang and Song Dynasty. Without further ado, I leave her the floor.
So thank you very much to the Foscari University of Venice and the Student Institute for Gesshin for offering me this opportunity to present on water words of Southern Sichuan. First, I would like to introduce myself. As mentioned before, my name is Francesca Monteith. I graduated my PhD in Beda in Peking University in 2021. And over the course of my PhD, I undertook about 6 years of fieldwork, mostly in Sichuan, but also in Gansu and Shanxi. So what does fieldwork look like? How do we go about understanding ancient worlds of Sichuan? Well, a lot of it involves interviewing local people, finding out where sites are. Your most common response when you ask someone, where is your cave temple? Is, we don't have any of those. You should go to Xi'an Buddha, which of course is very helpful, but not necessarily what we need. However, once we've ascertained that they do indeed have some form of cave temples close to where we are, we then spend some time normally getting lost either in vegetation or in interesting new innovations in the transportation network in China. But eventually we do get to the sites and we manage to record them. Here we have on the left a Taoist site, and then on the right we have Brenz in Renshaw and Jianshan in Fujian. And the main thing that I do, which isn't generally done by other researchers, is to, having looked at the Buddhas and spent a very, very long time examining them, measuring them, is to look in the other direction and think, well, where are these Buddhas? What are they doing? How are they doing it? Of course, the weather in Sichuan is not always very helpful with this, being as it's often cloudy or foggy. You don't necessarily get the best views of what's around the sites, but one can still get an idea of why people chose particular locations. So after 6 years of wandering around in the countryside, what did I find out? I generally found out that the distribution of sites in the region that I was studying was pretty uneven. We had high concentrations of sites in the Changqiu mountain range and in the Neijiang plain, but actually not really any in the Meishan plain, the Fujian plain, or elsewhere. A lot of sites associated with large rivers, and we'll look into that more later. Of course, the topography, the places where we find sites, is very different. Not all sites are going to be associated with water features. In many cases, like Kandangshan in Fujian, we have them on mountain peaks. There's no apparent relationship here at all with water. However, in sites like Yanjinggo in Fujian, you have a river that is closely associated with the site. And then, of course, you have situations like Xi'an Buddha, where you're associated with a very large and navigable river. However, the question remains, are these sites always close to rivers? In point of fact, not really. As you can see in the Changqiu mountain range, these sites are nowhere near major rivers. They're all up in the mountains. This indicates that actually sites have different functions. They're not all performing the same function. Of course, an interesting concept that I came across is this. When I was in Jiangye, which is actually quite a long way from Sichuan, over the summer, I was standing in Jintase looking out over this landscape, and a Professor Li standing next to me says, "You know what, Professor Fang? I think the main thing is there's always rivers in front of cave temples. I looked at him and I looked back at this landscape and I thought, really, Professor Lee, you're looking out at this landscape and the main thing you think of is the river that you can't see for the trees. It's an interesting idea that people would focus on the idea that there is a river there, but every valley is going to have a river. The valley has been created by a river. So you can't necessarily make the broad assumption that just because there is a river in the bottom of a valley, this river has anything to do with the reasons why the cave temple was carved in its location. Anyway, moving on. One interesting thing that's come out in scholarship in recent years is the concept of centralized hydrology, often under religious supervision. This was highlighted in Central India by Julia Shaw, and also the Greater Angkor Project has done some work looking at the hydrology of Angkor Wat and Angkor Thom. The main thing we need to consider here is, how do we interact with water? What is water? What do we consider water to be these days? For us, most often, we want water, we go to a tap, we turn on a tap and we can wash our hands, we can drink, we can shower, whatever we want to do. This is an immediately available resource. We have, most of us, have access to clean water most of the time. However, this tame and stable form of water occasionally comes back at us. We have flooding, we have typhoons, but it's mostly not something we're particularly scared of. We have bridges that take us over the rivers. We don't have to consider, how am I going to cross that river? Is that going to be dangerous? At what point is it going to flood? We trust our governments to look after us and make sure that that doesn't happen. And although it does happen, it doesn't happen that often. So in looking at how rivers are considered historically, especially in southern Sichuan, I would like to turn to two main sources. First one I'd like to look at is actually Zhiguai, or strange tales, strange stories, halfway between myths and fairy tales for ancient China. And these show the extent to which people historically saw the river as phenomenally powerful, but also tricky. They could create your fortune or destroy it in a minute. So, for instance, we have the tale of Chen Min, who said that he would give an offering of a silver ingot to the river god. And he didn't quite have enough money, so he decided just to get an iron ingot and have it plated with silver, so it would look like silver. He gave it to the temple, and then later the god spoke through a spirit medium and said, Chen Min has been bad. He said he would give me a full silver ingot, but actually he hasn't. He's given me a fake ingot. And so he instructed the spirit medium to throw the silver ingot onto the river. And then that ingot floated across the river and down the river and destroyed Chen Min's ship. So instead of getting the promotion that he'd hoped his offering would give him, he actually ended up with his ship sinking and dying, which is an unfortunate outcome. We also have a situation where, recorded in the Yoming Lu, where at Hanyang, there was a raft on the river and you had to give an offering at a particular temple. If you didn't give your offering at this temple, then your boat would sink when you went past that part of the river. A raft of wood would rise up and your ship would be destroyed. And one governor decided at the end of his term of office that this was enough. He was going to fix it. So he said, we're going to take boats there tomorrow and we're going to cut away this section of wood that keeps causing boats to founder here. And eventually the next day they went out and the raft had moved to a different location. And from that point on, no one needed to give offerings at the temple. We also have a lot of situations where you have magical ideas associated with rivers and with caves. So, for instance, there's one story of a man operating a ferry. And one day, a man wearing a yellow robe with yellow melons comes and steps on the boat. he goes across the river on the boat, and when he gets to the other side, the ferry master asks for payment. And the man doesn't say anything. And the ferry master says, well, maybe you could give me one of those melons. And the man spits onto the coin tray and walks off. The ferry master is understandably a little bit irritated by this, until he looks at the spit that's on his coin tray and realizes it's solid gold. And he looks up and the man's disappeared into a cave. So we have all sorts of spirits involved with the rivers, all these stories of magical happenings associated with rivers. So these aren't dead currents of water as we might see them today. They're populated with dragons, with spirits, with a whole court of officials who live within the rivers. And this affects both the way in which people would use the rivers, but the way in which they would be transported. The other form of historical text that we have relating to this time period are the diaries of traveling officials. In the Song Dynasty, officials would travel significantly. They would be on the road about 40% of the time. It seems like they would be sent down to one place only to be recalled a couple of years later. And in traveling between places, they don't appear to have really moved that fast. They tended to take their time, see the sights, make some inscriptions, stop off at a temple or two. And in part, this was required. In part, this is just being part of a cultured gentleman of the Song Dynasty. There are some places where it was deemed necessary to stop and make offerings. For instance, in one location in Zhejiang, an imperial edict by the Emperor Huizong, 1100 to 1125, stated that more than 500 boats had been wrecked in Zhenjiang. 500 boats have been wrecked in Zhenjiang in 3 years. So this is indicative of the amount of danger that was involved in traveling. We also have stories which record how officials traveling on the rivers were shipwrecked, and those who were virtuous managed to survive the shipwreck, but those who were not virtuous ended up being killed by the river. So there's a degree of wondering whether these stories are recorded as a warning to the officials to be good officials, or as a sort of bigging yourself up, saying, well, I was in a shipwreck, but I survived. So I'm definitely a good official. I'm not one of those horrible ones that steals money and does bad things. So what I'm trying to build up here is an idea of how people think about water in southern Sichuan during the Tang and Song dynasties, the way in which people interact with it. And one of the main ways that they appear to have interacted historically was in shipping and trade. In his records, Fanchenda mentions his surprise at seeing a large number of Sichuan boats in Jiangxi, when he returns, having been sent to Sichuan as punishment for failing to do well in a previous appointment. And this is interesting. Sichuan and Jiangxi are actually pretty far apart, and you have different types of boats on different sections of the river. So we have these officials recording, oh, I saw Sichuan boats down in Jiangsu or Jiangxi. I saw them in the lower river, the upper river. And we see, for instance, during the Song dynasty, Luzhou, Shuzhou, Meizhou, and Jiazhou in Sichuan became major boat building centers, with a total of 170 boats being constructed each year, cumulatively in these 4 locations. I can imagine you're wondering, why on earth would they need that many ships? And the main thing was that this Western Sichuan and the Tibetan Plateau served as the main source of horses for the Southern Song Empire. So these ships were being built in order to permit the horses to be delivered down the river. In fact, some records state that as many as 9,000 horses in a year would be transported down the Yangtze from the Sichuan Basin to the Delta. So we're seeing, but in the we also see boats carrying salt, rice, tea, pottery, and silk. It's a massive thoroughfare that's running on these rivers. Boats from all over taking things up and down the river. The lower and middle courses of the river appear to have been relatively safe, although there are records of bandits. However, the upper reaches of the Yangtze were considered to be very dangerous. You had rapids, you have shoals, you have whirlpools. Fan Qiangda records one section of the river where there was a rock which was referred to as the god's head, and it depended on how much of the god's head you could see as to whether or not you could pass through that particular gorge or not. And the first day he went there, people said, no, it's not. We can't go. The water's far too low. But then the next day, the water had risen 100 feet, and it was okay. 100 feet. So we're talking the water rising 30 meters. Now, I'm not sure if we can really trust this historical record. The idea of a river rising 30 meters and it's a somewhat terrifying concept, but this is what the historical text says. We also have records of dragon shrines, Longce, going along the rivers, and people would give offerings at each of these dragon shrines, because although in Western culture, a dragon is an element of fire, breathes fire, flies in the air. In Chinese culture, a dragon is a water elemental, lives in the rivers and the clouds, brings the rain, causes floods when annoyed, and can wreck your ship. So we have records of hundreds and hundreds of pigs, sheep, cows, and chickens being sacrificed at dragon temples in order to allow people to travel safely up and down, particularly the upper sections of the Yangtze River. Okay, so how do my cave temples, the sites that I've visited, relate to these transport networks? So first I'd like to show you Zhejiang. Translate that. Zhejiang is a really interesting location. It's set on a bend of the Nejiang River, and it has 4 different religious rock carving sites associated with the old Xiancheng, the old town. And there's also it's also a historical ferry which is associated with it. So one has to wonder why this particular location has so many cave temples. For instance, there are over 300 individual constructions at Yuhego, over 400 at Chonglongshan, with Donggaosi and Dongyansi being slightly later constructions. So there's a possibility that, not wanting to travel around this bend, people chose to travel past Zhejiang, or there was a particular overland route which passed this way. However, Yuhego is a very peculiar location for a temple, and it would appear that it was intended to serve the people who would have been doing haulage along the river, because although the boats could sail and could row, in many locations the only way to get the boat to move forward was for people to literally drag the boats along using hawsers. So this is the Yuhego site in Zhejiang. It's got a cave within it, and many of the carvings are within the cave or within the on the cliff face facing the cave. this cave would have been a natural spring. So it's a location, it's a cave close to a river with a natural spring. This is a sort of a magnet for being a sacred site associated with water, associated with the river, but also associated with the natural spring. It's one of two sites. So Chonglongshan on the left here, which is one of the other sites in Zhejiang, is also focused on a cave. So we see this association between caves, natural springs, and rivers, which lead to people wanting to carve more and more statues within a specific location. But we also can't overlook the fact that these sites developed so much because they were associated with the Tojiang River that goes around Zhejiang. I'd now like to look at three other sites which are all associated with major rivers in the southern Sichuan area, but each of which has its own characteristics in terms of the site, the type of site, and the way in which it's constructed. So first, I'd like to look at the Leshan Buddha. Leshan Buddha is the biggest historical Buddha in the world at 72 meters tall. It's also an interesting site in that we know when it was constructed. There's an inscription which dates to 802, which puts the construction of the Buddha as starting in 712. And the interesting thing here is this Buddha was not constructed all at once. It was constructed for a brief period of time, and then work on the site stopped for a bit, and then it started again. This is quite interesting because, as you can see from this map, the site of the Buddha is very close to Jiazhou, which would have been a county seat or a local government office, place where a local government office would have been. So the fact that despite the fact that you would have had boats traveling up and down this river all the time, and you have a major population center close to this Buddha, it still was not completed all in one go. This was in part due to the fact that a prefect who wasn't particularly fond of Buddhism took over in Jiazhou between the two periods in which the Buddha was constructed. However, we can also see that this Buddha isn't visible from the population center. This is where the Buddha is. You can see the pagoda on top of the cliff, but you can't actually see the Buddha unless you're coming straight down the river towards it. However, the Buddha was completed, which is in contrast to the Pinchang Buddha. Now, Pinchang Buddha is only constructed down to about its neck. It's located on a bend of the river, which would have been a pretty dangerous location on the river, liable to have shoals, whirlpools, etc. But this Buddha isn't completed. Why would this Buddha not have been completed? Well, the most likely cause would appear to be that it's not associated with any settlements, historically or present. So you wouldn't really have been able to go there easily. You wouldn't want to stop and climb up to this Buddha. So although the concept of having a big Buddha overlooking this dangerous section of the river is very interesting, it's just not in the right location to actually make it as a religious site associated with water. This is in contrast with Jiajiang Qianfoya, which cuts through a canyon, and the northern side of this canyon has hundreds of Buddhas carved into it. Most likely at this location, based on reading Fan Chenda's work, people would have got out of the boat, and then the boat would have been hauled up the river in order to prevent loss of life, but also to make the boat lighter, nominally. So it's possible that they would have had to walk past this religious rock carving anyway in order to go up the river, which then would explain why you have the hundreds and hundreds of carvings. Of course, the way we see this site now is not exactly the same as it would have been historically. The water levels are much lower now. And so, well, historically is looking at pictures from 1914, taken by Isabella Bird on her journey up the Changjiang. But this is the highest I ever saw the water level whilst visiting this region, although we can see that there is the potential for the water to flood as high as this meter. It doesn't appear to have done so since that was installed. Okay. So having looked at transport, I'd like to move on to industry and taxation, looking at the way in which religious sites interact with industry. In particular, Yanjingguo in Pujiang is a fascinating example of this. So this site appears to have its things backwards. Okay, so this site is set in a very narrow valley, and it consists of a salt well and a Buddhist carving. This Buddhist carving is just a single niche, which actually does not appear to have been completed. And it's got an associated inscription which dates to 812. Now, the concept of carving a niche associated with the salt well, and then the salt well is within the water, is interesting. Is this a case? So this salt well, based on ceramics excavated from within this salt well, it's posited that this salt well will have been used from the Han Dynasty, so approximately 217 through till the Ming Dynasty. So it definitely would have been seeing continuous use from several centuries before through to several centuries after this Buddha was carved. So what was the purpose in carving this niche? Why would you want to carve this niche associated with the well? It's possible that someone fell in the well, and then this is a sort of funerary structure that's intended to commemorate the person. Or it's possible that the well was starting to run out of salt and they wanted to get more salt. They wanted to improve their fortunes. It's just this concept of why do you build this niche in this location is something that hasn't really been investigated much in terms of religious rock carvings in Sichuan or cave temples in general. It's just they're next to transport routes. So another situation in which we have religious rock carvings which appear to be related to industry is in Rongqian. So Rongqian has 4 big Buddhas. Big Buddhas are generally considered to be Buddhas which are over 4 meters in height. Rongqian, which is historical Rongzhou, has 4 big Buddhas. This is Rongqian Big Buddha, which is the 2nd biggest Buddha in the world at 37 meters. Because sure, you don't get much for being 2nd place. They also have Arfosa, Gufosa, and Longdong, all of which contain large Maitreya Buddha images. This is the highest concentration of large Maitreya Buddha images of anywhere I've seen. But the question is why? Why do you have this concentration at this location? Most people say it's because of the salt mines in the Zigong area and the clay and iron in the mountains, in the Chang Mountains to the north. It's possible that the reason why the political seat during this time period was in Rongzhou and not in Zigong, as it is in the modern day, is due to the salt mines. Salt mines are not particularly nice places to be close to. You have off-gassing of methane in pretty large quantity. Actually, in Zigong, by the Ming Dynasty, they were collecting the methane in bladders, animal bladders, and then poking holes and lighting it so that they could have gas lamps at night, which seems pretty lethal, but apparently happened. So we also have a lot of situations where you have water appearing within Buddhist art. Water plays a significant role in Buddhist art and archaeology, and Buddhist art and scriptures. The concept of the lotus pond, the transition to nirvana through a lotus, is a very common motif in both Buddhist art and Buddhist scripture. So in Pho in Rongxian, there's an interesting niche, which I'd like to show you, niche 37, which has a depiction of a lotus pond carved into the base of the niche. So this niche and this base. As you can see that you have lotuses, but you also have fish swimming in this pond. So it's an interesting way, it's the only time I've seen it, but it's an interesting way of showing the extent to which water is considered part of the sacredness of these figures. We also see water and bridges commonly occurring in sutra carvings, Jinbian Hua, in the Sichuan region. As we can see here, you have the lotuses growing out of the water, pond shape here. A final example I'd like to give you is the Jiu Tolong in Dazu, Baodingshan, which is not technically southern Sichuan. But the way that the natural spring here has been manipulated in order for the dragons bathing the Buddha to actually be bathing the Buddha, the water, in the correct season, water pours out of the mouth of this dragon over the head of the Buddha. So the aim of this lecture was to highlight the fact that we have different types of sites. Some sites are constructed in order to protect transportation networks, and other sites are in order to draw power from spiritual locations such as caves and natural springs. And just to reinforce the concept that this element that we perceive as just part of the natural landscape had its own spirit, its own strength historically in China, its own courts, its own rules that humans had to obey or humans would be destroyed. Okay. Sorry, I think I went through that a little bit fast. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for this lecture. Really fascinating topic. And now we can have a Q&A session. So I have a very, very short question, and it's, did you find evidence of the use of these caves today as worship sites? Are they still used or not?
These sites are very often still in use. We find all sorts of fascinating little, fascinating evidence of ritual practice. So this goes to the normal things of incense and scarves being placed over the Buddhas. There's one particular site in Rongxian, the Arful Su site, that each time I've been there to do field work, the nuns who have a nunnery there, they ask me to clean the Buddha. Now the Buddha is 6 meters tall and I'm terrified of heights. So I actually, each time I've been there, I've managed to convince my co-workers who've gone along with me to climb up on the Buddha and help to clean the Buddha, which is indicative of, these monks, these nuns are happy for us to come and look at this Buddha, but they also want us to assist in worshipping and cleaning the Buddha. In other cases, we find, I guess the best term would be poppets, sort of wooden sculptures that are created and then placed within the niches. And I have yet to find a single person who will admit to having placed one of these in a cave temple or tell me what the function is. But I'm hopeful at some point in fieldwork in the near future, I will be able to find out. If you give me a second, I should be able to find some pictures to show you. what I'm talking about.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question in the top box. I'm going to read it. What are some other regions of China that indicate a similar phenomenon? Longmen grottos plus Yi River in Henan comes to mind.
Yes, so the Longmen grottos and the Yungan grottos are also associated with rivers. Each site is essentially, every cave temple does have a river associated with it. However, in both cases, these are imperial cave temples, and they largely appear to be associated with the main pass associated with the capital city. So the Yi River and the Longmen grottos, you have this situation where the main pass out of imperial control towards southern China goes through this mountain. So you have the cave temple there, sort of creating a spiritual blockade between the capital and whatever lies to the south. But there is that connection. I just managed to find, okay, if you can see on screen 2, I've shown the picture of the poppets that you find in the religious rock carving sites in southern Sichuan. So this is sort of, like you say, the modern practice. And someone here, we can see that someone's just left an orange on one of these, just in the bottom of the niche for no particular, like some, there's obviously a reason, but no one's willing to tell me what the reason is.
And there's another question. When and why people stopped the carving of these statues? Was it because locals and governments changed their way to look at the sites or the function of Buddhist iconography?
Okay, so what I see in looking at religious rock carving sites across all of where I've been to in China is you have this thing where it starts with repetition of the same imagery. So mostly the earliest sites in this region of Sichuan will be one Buddha, two Bodhisattvas, two disciples, and heavenly kings, symmetrical arrangement of niches. And then afterwards, you start to have more and more different forms. So something like this would be the typical type of arrangement that you would see in an earlier niche. And then you get more and more themes taking over as the canon expands and the themes that people can start to depict increase. And you see a reduction in the number of small niches and intrusive niches. As you can see in this picture, people have carved their own little niches around this much bigger niche. And this thing occurs a lot in the earlier periods, but actually as time goes on, it starts to tail off. And in the later sites, in Song Dynasty sites in Dazu, for instance, they're much less evident, or they don't really occur. And my personal opinion is this has a large part to do with the development of paper and printing in China towards the mid to late Tang Dynasty, wherein people could start to get printed images of sutras rather than expending the time and energy of creating one carved into stone. You could get this perfect representation that would be printed over and over again. So there's a transition in practice, I believe, that's caused by an evolution of technology, which then leads to cave temples becoming much, much more the preserve of the elite who create very large and beautiful cave temples during the Song Dynasty, and not so much the preserve of not the preserve of lesser people who wouldn't have the same, who would have previously chosen to carve a niche, but now we're choosing to get a print of a sutra instead.
Okay, thank you.
So what's the agency of the river? What do you see in the sources? The whole human, non-human connection. Is there something that you are finding that is of interest to this kind of conversation, environmental conversation that we're having these days on the agency of the non-human?
In terms of the human-non-human interaction, in most of the historical texts, we see it very much as being the dragons in the river or the river officials who are either playing up and need to be controlled by virtuous monks or by righteous officials, or we see them choosing to punish those officials or monks who are not good enough or virtuous enough. But in terms of how that relates directly to the cave temple sites, I would assume it's an evolution of the dragon shrines, in that these are ways in which people can communicate with these non-human entities in the rivers.
Absolutely, yeah. And is there something that you're doing in your ethnography that explores these sort of questions?
It's definitely a question I need to look at more. Most of what I've been doing is examining the landscape and trying to work out why these sites are carved in the locations that they are carved in.
They are,
but
yeah, absolutely.
I need to move beyond that, perhaps to consider the people-based concept in more detail.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have other questions in the chat. To what extent are these sites still revered to this day? For example, the Leshan Buddha is still much visited, but is this for religious or cultural reasons?
Okay, so I can't speak for the exact percentages, but when I visit religious rock carving sites that are kaifeng, as in open for tourism, I tend to observe maybe 95% of the people who are visiting, for instance, the Longmen Caves around Spring Festival time are going there just to look at the caves, but you still have a small percentage of, admittedly, mostly older people who are going there and absolutely devotedly doing bye-bye, praying to each one of the Buddhas as they go past. So there's definitely a percentage of people who are still visiting for religious reasons, and that percentage increases closer to the main festivals, Qingming and Chunjie, for instance. But a lot of it is definitely the Instagram generation, sorry, the Douyin generation.
Thank you. Thanks for the interesting lecture. Is water somehow mentioned in Buddhist prayers?
Not that I am entirely aware of. There's one story of a monk who has a dream where he's died and he goes down into the afterlife, and he's taken along a river and he's shown all the different hells and all the different afterlives, and he's told that since he was a virtuous person, he has been put in charge of looking after all these afterlives. But in terms of specific prayers, I would need to do more research.
Are there other questions?
I'll ask one more question, if I may.
Absolutely.
Sorry, is this a book or are you writing one?
This is a section of my PhD thesis, expanded upon.
Right.
But I'm hoping to publish my PhD thesis in the next year or so.
Wonderful, wonderful. How many sites are we talking about in total?
I have surveyed, I've been to over 200 sites in the Sichuan Basin. I based, and probably over 300 sites now in all of China. And I based my PhD thesis on about 144 in southern Sichuan.
That's great. Thank you. Very impressive. Thank you so much. I look forward to reading the book. Yeah.
I look forward to finally finishing translating it back into English.
All right. Oh, you wrote it in Chinese, right?
Yes. If all your doubts and questions have been solved, I think we can thank again Francesca Monteith for this really interesting lecture.